everyone, my name is Michael. I work for The Collective and I focus on cybersecurity. I'm here today to talk to you about endpoint security. Now, when we talk about endpoint security, we talk about a lot of stuff, right? It's not just an antivirus, it's not just anti-malware, it's not just an EDR. There's a lot of things to consider, right? And when you put things in perspective, there is multiple layers that you'll have to consider. First of all, there's the operating system hardening. There is the antivirus, anti-malware, EDR. And basically, it's XDR, right? We want to be as protected as we can be. But even with just hardening and an EDR and malware, we're not just there. Think about it. Your endpoint is what your users are using on a daily basis to do their jobs. So there is an exposure to all sorts of risks. There is an exposure through email, there is an exposure through the browser, through the files they open, through devices they connect. Basically, they're considered the first and foremost entry point into your organization, or should I say the weakest link. And because of that, there is a lot of work that goes into protecting the endpoints. Now, 30 minutes at most is not enough to cover all these topics. So we'll focus a little bit more today on everything that's antivirus, anti-malware, and as you know, that translates into Defender for Endpoint. And forgive me if I still call it Defender ATP, but as the names have changed recently, I'll need a little bit longer to actually make that work. So basically, considering all the things, where do you start? Right? What is the first step that you take? Well, in my opinion, the first step that you take is looking at what are you dealing with? What are the risks that are specific to your environment? Obviously, I don't know any organization that doesn't use email. So, the fact that email can come into your environment is something that you'll have to look into. But then more specifically towards your endpoint, how does that translate into a risk, right? A phishing attachment, a malicious link, how are you going to deal with that? First, you've got your first line of defense, your firewalls, your message hygiene solutions, but what do you do and how do you protect that endpoint? And that's when you get to a solution like Defender for Endpoints, right? Because it can detect all the threats that are materializing on your device. It can stop the effects of such an attack before it actually does harm. And it can give you a lot of insights into what's happening in your environment. In a way, Defender for Endpoints, in my opinion, is a catalyst for everything else that you do within the M365 security stack. It's a centerpiece that can fuel information into other platforms. It can consume data from other platforms and therefore increase the security of your environment. Now, all things considered, where do you start? Well, what I'm going to talk to you about today is the experience that we've gained over a lot of these projects that we've done in the past year. Two of them are with Belgian customers, fairly large ones. One of them is Atlas Copco, where they've got 45,000 endpoints that we've deployed with Defender for the endpoints. And then the other one is Umicore that have a couple of thousand endpoints as well, where we deployed it in the same way. Now, the question we get is, how do you do that? How much time does that take? Well, when we get to the deployment and considering all the things, then you'll have to think, what is the goal? Where do we want to get to, right? Is it the hardening of the operating system? Is it to become better at detecting things? And then obviously you'll have to marry all of these things a little bit together, right? So from a deployment perspective, you have to consider the following. How do you manage Defender ATP? How do you manage the policies? Like any other antivirus product, they have a console through which you're going to have to create your policies, manage the policies, update policies, react to alerts, and do other things. In Microsoft's world, it's not a separate console. It's integrated with the endpoint management suites, Microsoft Endpoint Manager, and then either Intune or SCCM or MEMCM, as I should say. Those are the ones that you really want to focus on. Sure, you can set policies through GPO and PowerShell, but in our opinion, those are not really the ways that you want to go through. You want to be in Intune, you want to be in the cloud as much as you can, and by lack thereof, then you can fall back, in my opinion, into SCCM. But if you've got SCCM today, it doesn't mean that you have to abandon it. What you need to do and what you should be doing is looking forward to how you can make that co-managed. That's potentially, and not potentially, that's in our opinion our preferred approach in larger environments that already have that infrastructure in place. And why is that? Well, first of all, it allows you to easily deploy the Defender ATP agent at I hate to call it an agent, but it's basically enable it on the operating system when we're talking about Windows 10 and similar operating systems. So it makes it a real breeze. And to give you some figures, right? It took us 3 weeks together with Atlas Copco to roll out about 45,000 endpoints. Now consider that, 45,000 endpoints in merely 3 weeks. That's amazing, right? That's how fast it is. That's also how easy it is to deploy because it's core to the operating system of Windows 10, which means you light up the features, and then all of a sudden it starts reporting back into your tenant. Now, there's a couple of other things to consider, right? Things that we've experienced throughout these deployments is network connectivity. Well, it's a different approach than how it was done previously or how traditionally the other solutions work. Like, let's take a competitor that has a solution on premises. Well, all your endpoints connect to that on-premises server. They report back their data. There is analysis that's being done there. That's how you drive the solution. But here we're talking about a cloud solution, which means there has to be internet connectivity. And as such, that's not really a problem for most organizations these days. But you have to think of the way that it interacts on the machine. So Defender ATP, or Defender for Endpoints, I should say, is connecting through the machine context. And this is where things can get a little bit tricky, right? Because once you connect to the internet, it actually does so from the system context, which means that your proxy should be able to accept the fact that it's from the machine context. If you do user authentication, you don't accept the computer authentication, then you're going to run into a little bit of an issue. Now, what I mean with an issue is nothing is insurmountable. You can open up an exception so that your devices can directly connect to the cloud, or you can work through an internal proxy that all the traffic is routed there. But those are things that you'll have to consider when you're deploying Defender ATP or Defender for Endpoints so that you make sure that you have a reliable connection. Now, all things considered, these are one of the very small things that can really bite you in a royal behind when planning a large-scale deployment. But other than that, it's a pretty smooth sailing. Once you've enabled the Defender ATP on the endpoint, you'll start seeing them pop up in the portal and start feeding in the data that you can consume for other things that we're going to talk about later. Now, interestingly, there's two different approaches that you can take to enablement of Defender for Endpoints. If you take the Microsoft approach, they basically tell you do Defender antivirus first and then move over to Defender ATP. Personally, I'd like to do it the other way around, right? If you've already have your solution today, and let's say that you have a basic anti-malware solution, then enabling Defender for Endpoints on top of that gives you that edge that within 3 weeks you've got EDR running on top of everything, you get the data that you need, and that data actually helps you better deploy the Defender antivirus component on the machine itself. So turning around the order in which that you deploy these things is actually very helpful, and that's something to consider because we found that to be much easier to do and much faster to execute, therefore driving and maximizing value for your organization. So definitely something to keep in mind. Now, what happens, right? You've enabled Defender ATP or Defender for Endpoints. And if you've got a third-party antivirus, then you're still good. There is hardly any interference. If you've got multiple EDRs, then things may get a little bit trickier, and you'll have to set some exclusions. But running Defender for Endpoints on top of an existing antivirus is fairly okay. Doesn't cause any issues, which sets you up for later, as I mentioned. Now, what you do have to consider is the policies that you're going to apply on the machine, right? And which is a little bit what brings me to how'd you do that? Well, this is the traditional question about waterfall versus agile. And I hope the pictures kind of represent that. But the waterfall approach is something we absolutely don't like to use with Defender for Endpoints or any security technology for that matter. And for the reason, things are moving as fast or faster than you can follow up with. They're literally changing the landscape as you're walking through on your journey. And because of that, trying to map out every little detail in order to create a package that you can deploy to your endpoints and be done with it isn't really an approach that is appropriate for anything that is cloud related. Instead, you may have already noticed it a little bit, we start small and then increase over time capabilities. For instance, you start with the onboarding, then you do one more policy and another one and another one and another one. And then after a while, you've started with very early on increasing protection on your endpoints and then increasing it even more and more as you add policies, as you tweak your policies. Now, in order to do that, in order to be able to do that in a successful way, you actually have to create these deployment rings. And I may sound like a broken record because you've heard it so many times, but this approach actually works really well. You create some sort of canary mill, right? It's a ring of 4, 5, 6 machines, and you deploy Defender for Endpoints on those machines. You create a couple of policies, which may or may not include the antivirus already, but you do attack surface reduction in audit mode. You do the web protection in audit mode. Basically, you don't block anything to start with, but that starts fueling in data. And as a matter of fact, you could already do that at a larger scale because you're not blocking anything, you're just getting data. And then you start with that first ring. Okay, so let's analyze the data we get from attack surface reduction, and let's see what we can put into block mode. And then once you get that data, you put it into block mode, you deploy that policy into that smaller ring, and you see what happens, and you get feedback. And then you go to a slightly larger ring, and then a larger one and a larger one until you get to the entire organization. And this is a continuous approach that you do for anything, whether it's exploit protection, attack surface reduction rules, whether you're deploying antivirus policies, you're tweaking them, adding exclusions, basically anything you do that in that ring approach. But the benefit to your organization is that you're moving forward from day one rather than trying to do everything and create a policy package that includes everything in order to deploy them across the entire estate. And even there is no such thing as one policy that fits everything. Every organization has different types of computers, right? Devices, some of them are a specific operating system, some of them are legacy operating systems, there may be servers involved, there may be Linux devices there, some of them are for information workers, others are for production devices, literally, very critical systems, so you want to treat them differently, and so you have to account for that as well. Now, the way that you do that is by, first of all, getting the feedback from everyone, right? As you deploy these rings, as you push out a new policy, as you create multiple policies, have that short feedback loop, especially during deployment, so that you know what is happening, right? That is super crucial because the funny thing is, if you use Intune and SCCM, changing and updating a parameter is really quick. You can change something on the fly, deploy it right away, and the effects are almost immediate, which is great. Obviously, there is a sync interval between the devices and the endpoint managers in order to get the new policies, but you could force them. And because you have that ring approach, you'll almost not run into any issues if you take that approach, right? You will eventually block something on a device that doesn't need to be blocked. But if you do it on a scoped environment first and then scale out, then you do no harm to the environment, because that's what most organizations are afraid of, right? Rolling out a new security solution and halting production or causing issues for a majority of your users. Now, all of this is logic, right? This is not a new approach, this is not very special, but it is something that works. Now, one thing to consider when you drive the solution, right? Considering that you've gone past the deployment, past the onboarding, that all your devices are reporting in, maybe there's a few hiccups here and there because of network connectivity. Well, how do you drive that? Well, this is where things change a little compared to traditional security solutions. Because it is an integrated solution, Defender relies heavily on Endpoint Manager. Now, traditionally, a lot of organizations have a security team that care about everything that is security related, and you have an endpoint team that does everything that is endpoint related, deployment of endpoints, configuration of endpoints. In the world of Defender, they kind of come together because the security team will need to create policies in Endpoint Manager. They will need Endpoint Manager for the onboarding, for the follow-up, for some of the reporting, and vice versa. Which also means that you're going to have a crossbleed of these responsibilities across teams, and that is rather important to consider, especially if you've got these silos where one team does one thing and another team does something entirely else on the security side. So they're going to come closer together. Doesn't necessarily mean that you have to use the functionalities that a Defender offers of creating tickets within the portal and then sending it to the Intune team. You can still rely on your own ITSM solution. You can still have separate teams, but you'll have to make sure that they can get access to one another's tools in order to be efficient in what they're doing. Now, as such, what is the true benefit of a solution that is cloud powered, right? You could say crowdsourcing is one of them, and this is where Defender actually really excelled, right? There is a lot of data that Microsoft has that allows them to apply more security to your endpoints. But it's also the other way around. It's a very smart system that can help you drive down the efforts that you have to put into it. Once you've onboarded devices, let's take the example of Atlas Copco with 45,000 endpoints, then it is our opinion that let the technology help you rather than responding to alerts that you see, and that could be a lot of alerts based on the number of endpoints you have. You should move as quickly as you can into some sort of automated response. And that automated response is the automated investigation and response that you have in Defender. But in order to get there, you have to create machine groups where you can categorize the devices into several, let's say, levels of automation. The basic level is, there's not a lot of automation, there's investigation going on, but the EDR components won't take any action until an administrator approves it. And that is great when you're just getting started, but once you've got the plethora of devices in there, you want to move to a full automation as much as possible. Now, you have to be careful there because full automation will do an investigation, and if it thinks that it found something malicious, or if there is something malicious, it will block, it will quarantine, it will take action for you, right? Without an administrator actually having to look at that. Now, that's great because from a security perspective, you're safe. But sometimes, it might actually do something at a device and block the device from functioning. This is why you need these machine groups so that the plethora of your devices, the majority that is used for information workers, you put them in the full automated range of devices, and then the smaller ones or the smaller groups with devices for production that are super business critical and that you don't want to touch unless someone has verified what it's going to do and has approved the action, you put them into a different group and therefore a different automation level. And that's the number one thing that you have to remember when doing Defender, right? It's not just set and forget and we're done. Let the technology help you. And through that, you're going to see that the number of alerts that you're going to have to deal with is literally going to jump off the cliff and frees up time for the security team to start being more proactive through hunting, going through the data from attack surface reduction, tweaking the policies in attack surface reduction, and therefore helping you become more successful with the technology at hand. And that's a little bit of recipe for success, right? Onboarding, tweaking, automation, and then go back, right? It's kind of creating a process, which is literally what you want to do because you want to be super fast. You want to respond to a threat as soon as it is there. But now what, right? You've deployed it, you've got your policies, you've set your automation level, therefore you're super agile, you're super fast in responding to alerts that come in because the system is doing it for you, and you only care about what's left, right? The leftovers that the Defender for Endpoints can't deal with. But is this where you stop? Well, obviously it isn't, right? You have to create a process. It's a loop. It's an infinite process where you're going to consume the data from Defender because it's not just an interesting and a smart system for you that will look at malicious activities or activities in total on the device and try and reason over them to correlate whether or not activity was malicious and there's a sign of an attack or malware or anything else. It also fuels you with a lot of data that can help you figure out what your attack surface is. Now, I've mentioned it a couple of times, and I've spoken about attack surface reduction. Attack surface reduction literally means what it says, right? It reduces the attack surface of your device on a number of angles of attack that malicious actors typically use, like dumping credentials from LSASS. You can literally lock that down. But there is one thing that I believe is highly underrated in Defender for Endpoints, and that's the TVM module, right? The Threat and Vulnerability Management. Remember what I said when I started off with the presentation, that it's about preparing, but about knowing what you're dealing with and about OS hardening? Well, hardening an operating system, and by extension, hardening a device, is also making sure that you patch it regularly, that you know what software is running on there, that you patch that software as well. And TVM is really great at giving you that visibility. Now again, depending on how you're organized, it actually may mean that one team is going to have to patch it, but the security team can get these reports, see what they need to configure on the operating system, see what applications are there, see which applications need to be updated, and then give that information to the endpoint management teams for them to act upon that. Now, what we typically do is take a customer on that journey. as we go through the onboarding and they don't have such a process, we try and schedule these meetings. Make sure that they are aware of the data that's coming back from the defender for endpoints. Make sure that they have regular status meetings to follow up on, hey, how are we going to progress on the attack surface reduction rules? How are we going to include or extend our reach of policies, endpoint protection, web protection, maybe even application guard? How are we going to proceed further? How are we doing on the patching cycle? Because Defender for endpoints can give you through TVM literally week after week, month after month, these are your exposed endpoints. These are the patches that are missing. You can also map a little bit how well you're doing from a TVM perspective and from a general vulnerability management perspective as well. Now, as I said, I've only got a limited amount of time. There's only so much, maybe like less than that, which we covered from endpoint protection. There is a sea of information out there. There is so many things that you can do, but what you should remember is that it's more than one thing, and if you need to do one thing, then I can absolutely recommend Defender for Endpoints because it touches so many things. It goes a mile deep in some areas, but it also goes a mile wide in protecting your operating system, and therefore brings huge value, right? Plus the data you get if you fuel it into cloud app security, which some of my colleagues will be talking about during this week or have talked about during this week, you will see that you kind of get this whole picture and that you kind of extend the security across the entire platform in a much easier way than you would think that is possible. So with that being said, I really appreciate you listening to me. There is a live Q&A starting right now, so jump into the other meeting, ask me some questions, and I'll see if I can help. Thank you so much, and see you next time.